My daughter-in-law threw me an eviction notice and said, "I own this house now, old man." I'm Bill Harrison, and at 63, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal. I was wrong. See, while I was paying $50,000 in medical bills for my dying son, Stephanie was already planning her new life. While I was arranging his funeral, she was texting her boyfriend about selling our house. While I was grieving in my son's childhood bedroom, she was calculating how much money she'd make once the pathetic old man was gone. But here's what gold diggers never understand about grief. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous. Because when that eviction notice came back with her name on it instead of mine, when 25 people discovered the truth at what she thought was her victory party, well, let's just say some lessons cost more than others. I hope you'll subscribe and join me for this story, because sometimes the quietest people have the loudest surprises. But first, let me take you back to the day my world ended. September 15th, 2023. That's the day Jake lost his battle with cancer. My son was 34 years old, a Purple Heart veteran from Iraq, and the strongest person I ever knew. But cancer doesn't care about strength. The funeral was 3 days later. I remember sitting in the front pew at St. Matthew's, watching Stephanie sob into tissues while people lined up to tell me what a wonderful boy I'd raised. And she was grieving. I believed that then. Jake had been her world for 5 years, married since 2018. But even during those first awful weeks, I started noticing things, like how Stephanie treated me during the funeral planning. Jake had always handled the family finances, and I figured she was just overwhelmed. But when I offered to help with the arrangements at Miller's funeral home, she looked at me like I was intruding. "Bill, I appreciate it, but this is something I need to handle," she said, not even looking up from her phone. "You know Jake would want me to take care of everything." The funeral cost $8,000. I paid it. My teacher's pension is $2,800 a month, and I'd been helping Jake with his medical bills since the diagnosis. The treatments at IU Health Methodist cost over $100,000 total. Insurance and VA benefits covered most of it, but I paid the $50,000 in deductibles and non-covered treatments. I'd used most of my late wife's life insurance money, but Jake was my son. You do what you have to do. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. Stephanie never once said thank you for paying those bills. Never acknowledged that I was sacrificing my retirement savings for my dying son. She just expected it. The second sign came 2 weeks after the funeral. I was staying in Jake's old bedroom, the same room where he'd played with his G.I. Joe figures, and later studied for his high school history tests. Stephanie had never explicitly invited me, but she hadn't told me to leave either. I was helping sort through Jake's things, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate. That's when I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen. "I know, Travis, I know," she was saying, "but I have to wait a little longer. He's still hanging around like some lost puppy." I froze. Travis? Who was Travis? "No, it's not forever," she continued, "just until I figure out how to handle the situation. The old man's been paying all the bills anyway. Might as well let him keep doing it until I don't need him anymore." She was talking about me, the old man, 6 months after my son died, and I was already just an inconvenience to be managed. I stood there in Jake's doorway, looking at his Indianapolis Colts jersey, still hanging in the closet, number 18, Peyton Manning's number. Jake had saved up for 3 months to buy that jersey when he was 15. Now it was just another thing Stephanie would probably throw away or sell. That night I lay in Jake's twin bed, staring at the ceiling where he'd stuck glow-in-the-dark stars when he was 8. My wife Sarah had helped him arrange them into constellations. Big Dipper, Little Dipper, Orion's Belt. She'd been gone 5 years now, and Jake was supposed to be the one carrying on our family story. Instead, I was a 63-year-old man sleeping in a child's bedroom, being called the old man by the woman my son loved enough to marry. But here's what Stephanie didn't understand about grief. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you focused. And lying there in my son's room, surrounded by 20 years of his memories, I started focusing very clearly on exactly who Stephanie Parker really was. What I discovered over the next few months would change everything. Let me tell you what this house meant to my family, because if you don't understand that, you won't understand why I couldn't just walk away. Sarah and I bought this 3-bedroom ranch in 1987 for $85,000. We were both teachers then. She taught elementary, I taught high school history. The house was nothing special, just a modest home on Maple Street in a quiet neighborhood outside Indianapolis. But it was ours. Jake took his first steps on this living room carpet. Sarah and I taught him to ride a bike in this driveway. When he came home from Iraq with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares he wouldn't talk about, this house was where he healed. The basement was where he built model airplanes when his hands needed something to do. The backyard was where we threw his welcome home barbecue. After Sarah died in 2019, Jake moved back in to help take care of me. Not because I needed taking care of, but because he needed to feel useful again. The VA was helping with his PTSD, but he said staying busy helped more than any medication. He got a job at the Ford plant, met Stephanie at a church social, and started talking about the future again. The house was worth $385,000 now, according to Zillow. All that equity came from Sarah's life insurance money and 25 years of mortgage payments. Jake never owned this house. I never put his name on the deed. He lived here, sure, but legally this was always my property. But it wasn't really about the money. In Jake's closet, there was still a shoebox full of his letters from deployment. Sarah had saved everyone. In the garage, his tool collection was organized exactly the way he'd left it. Every socket wrench in order, every screwdriver in its place. The Purple Heart citation hung in a frame above the fireplace, right next to our wedding photo from 1984. This house was the only place left where Jake still existed. If I lost it, I'd lose the last physical connection to my son. The bedroom where he'd recovered from his war wounds. The kitchen table where Sarah had helped him with homework. The front porch where he'd proposed to Stephanie with my grandmother's ring. But Stephanie didn't see memories. She saw dollar signs. I started noticing her measuring rooms in October, taking photos of the furniture, making notes on her phone about staging and market value. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was just getting organized. This place has so many memories, she'd say, but her eyes were calculating square footage. By November, she was having hushed phone conversations about property values and quick sales. I pretended not to notice, but I was listening, always listening. That's when I understood what I was really fighting for. This wasn't just about a house. It was about whether Jake's memory would be honored or auctioned off to the highest bidder. If I stayed silent, if I let Stephanie push me around because I was just the grieving father, here's what would happen. She'd sell the house within 6 months. The buyer would gut the interior, paint over Sarah's careful decorating choices, and turn Jake's childhood home into some generic flip property. The new owners would never know that a war hero had once lived here, or that a teacher had spent 30 years grading papers at the kitchen table, or that a little boy had once arranged glow-in-the-dark stars on his bedroom ceiling. I'd end up in some efficiency apartment across town, surrounded by strangers, with nothing left of my family but a few photo albums and Jake's Purple Heart. At 63, starting over with a pension that barely covered basic expenses. But worse than losing the house would be losing the fight itself. If I let Stephanie bully me out of my own home, I'd be proving her right. That grief had made me weak. That old men should just accept whatever scraps they're given. That Jake's father wasn't worth basic respect. Every morning I'd wake up knowing I'd failed the final test of my son's life. That when it mattered most, when someone tried to profit from his death and disrespect his memory, his father had just given up. So no, I couldn't walk away. This house was where I'd raised Jake, where Sarah and I had built our life together, where 3 generations of my family had called home. It was worth fighting for. The question was, how does a 63-year-old retired teacher fight a woman who thinks tears are weapons and lies are strategy? That's when I remembered something I used to tell my students. Knowledge is power, but applied knowledge is victory. It was time to start applying some knowledge. The first real confrontation happened on December 3rd, 2023. I remember the date because it was Jake's birthday. He would have been 35. I'd spent the morning at Greenwood Cemetery, bringing fresh flowers to his grave. Yellow roses, his favorite since he was a kid. Sarah used to plant them along our back fence every spring. When I got home around noon, there was a black Ford F-150 pickup truck in my driveway. I walked into my own house and found Stephanie in the kitchen with a man I'd never seen before. Tall guy, maybe 40, wearing expensive jeans and a polo shirt that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. They were sitting at my kitchen table, looking at papers spread out between them. "Bill!" Stephanie jumped up like I'd caught them doing something wrong. "You're back early." "From visiting my son's grave," I said quietly. "On his birthday." The man stood up and extended his hand. "Travis Mitchell. Pleasure to meet you, sir." Travis. So this was the voice I'd been hearing on all those phone calls. I shook his hand. Firm grip, confident smile. The kind of guy who probably sold property management services and thought he knew more than everyone else. "Nice to meet you, Travis. How did you know Jake?" Stephanie's face went pale. "Oh, Travis is he's helping me with some financial planning. Figuring out the estate stuff." "Estate stuff?" I looked at the papers on the table. Real estate listings, mortgage pre-approval forms, property assessment documents. "What estate stuff?" Travis cleared his throat. "Well, sir, Stephanie mentioned that there might be some transitions happening. I work in property management, so I'm just helping her understand her options." "Her options," I repeated. "Bill, maybe we should talk about this later," Stephanie said. She was using that voice again, the same tone she'd used at the funeral home, like I was a child interrupting adult conversation. "No, let's talk about it now." I sat down at my own kitchen table. "What options are we discussing?" Travis looked at Stephanie, who nodded slightly. "Well, sir, given the current market conditions, this property has significant equity potential. Stephanie could easily clear $300,000 after closing costs. That's enough to make a fresh start. Maybe relocate somewhere with better opportunities." "Relocate," I said. "The thing is, Bill," Stephanie's voice got that patient, explaining to an elderly person tone, "this house is really too big for one person, and maintaining it is expensive. The property taxes alone are $4,500 a year." "I've been paying those property taxes for 36 years, I said. "I know, but now that Jake's gone," she paused, like she was choosing her words carefully. "Now that Jake's gone, it doesn't make financial sense to keep such a big place. For either of us." Travis nodded sagely. "Real estate is all about timing, sir. Interest rates are starting to climb. If you wait too long, you could lose significant value." "And where exactly would I go?" I asked. "Well, there are some really nice senior communities," Stephanie said brightly. "Places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work. You could make friends your own age." "Senior communities." "The Willows has a great reputation," Travis added. "My grandmother lived there for 3 years before she passed. Really quality care." I looked at these two people sitting in my kitchen, planning my life like I wasn't even there, on my son's birthday, in the house where he'd grown up. "Here's what I don't understand," I said. "This house has been in my name since 1987. I've been paying property taxes for 36 years. Jake lived here, but he never owned it." The silence stretched out like a wire about to snap. Travis looked at Stephanie. Stephanie looked at the papers on the table. That can't be right," she said finally. "Jake always talked about this place like it was his. Jake loved this house. He grew up here, but love doesn't transfer ownership." I stood up. "Travis, I appreciate you trying to help, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Now wait just a minute," Stephanie's voice got sharp. "Jake was your son. Everything he had should go to his wife. Everything Jake did go to his wife. His car, his personal belongings, his savings account, but this house was never Jake's to leave anyone." Travis was already gathering up his papers. Smart man. He could see which way this was heading and was calculating his exit strategy. "Bill, you need to understand something." Stephanie stood up too, and for the first time I heard the real person underneath all that fake sweetness. This is my house now? Jake left everything to me, and that includes this place. You're just visiting. Visiting? I repeated. That's right. And Travis thinks, we think, it would be better for everyone if you found somewhere else to stay. Somewhere more appropriate for someone your age. I looked at this woman my son had loved enough to marry. This woman I'd welcomed into my family, whose wedding I'd helped pay for, whose grief I'd respected, even when it felt performative. Stephanie, I said, I've lived in this house for 36 years. I raised my son here. I buried my wife from here. And now you want me to leave because it would be better for everyone? Sometimes change is hard, she said, but it's necessary. Travis was already heading for the door. Maybe we should continue this conversation another time. No, Travis, stay, I said. I want you to hear this too. I looked directly at Stephanie. You want me out of my own house, on my son's birthday, so you can sell it and move somewhere with your boyfriend. Her mouth fell open. Did you think I was blind? Deaf? Did you think grief made me stupid? Bill, I don't know what you think you... I think we're done with this conversation, I said. Both of you. After they left, I sat in my empty kitchen for a long time, looking at the chair where Jake used to eat his breakfast before school. That's when I realized something important. Stephanie had just declared war on the wrong old man. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to James Fletcher. I'd found his business card in my wallet while looking for my insurance information. James had been Jake's Little League coach 15 years ago, before he went to law school and started practicing family law. He'd given me the card at Jake's funeral, squeezing my shoulder and saying, Bill, if you ever need anything at all, you call me. I called him. James Fletcher Law Office, a receptionist answered. This is Bill Harrison. I'd like to speak with James about some property issues. One moment, please. James came on the line 30 seconds later. Bill, how are you holding up? I'm managing. James, I need some advice about property law, hypothetically speaking. Of course. What's the situation? If someone lives in a house but isn't on the deed and they die, does their spouse automatically inherit the property? There was a pause. No, Bill. Property ownership follows the deed, not residency. Is everything okay? Just checking on some things. Could we meet sometime this week? I might need to review some documents. Absolutely. How's Thursday at 2? Perfect. And James, this conversation stays between us for now. Attorney-client privilege, Bill, always. The second call was to Linda Torres at Midwest Investigations. I'd found her website after Googling Private Investigator Indianapolis. Her photos showed a serious-looking woman in her 40s, former military, specializing in family cases. The reviews mentioned her discretion and thoroughness. Midwest Investigations, Linda speaking. Ms. Torres, my name is Bill Harrison. I need to hire someone to gather information about a family situation. What kind of information, Mr. Harrison? I believe my daughter-in-law is being dishonest about her activities since my son's death. I need documentation. I see. Can you be more specific? I think she's been having an affair. I need proof of when it started and how long it's been going on. I understand. My rate is $75 an hour plus expenses. I require a $500 retainer. That's fine. How soon can we meet? I have an opening tomorrow at 10 a.m. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and really looked around. This house that Stephanie wanted to sell, that Travis saw as equity potential, that they thought I'd just hand over without a fight. I'd always known the house was mine. I'd been paying property taxes for 36 years, after all. What I hadn't realized was that Stephanie didn't know this. She'd assumed Jake owned it because he'd lived here his whole life, and I'd never thought to correct her assumption. Why would I? It had never mattered before, but now it mattered everything. I pulled out my file cabinet and found the documents I needed. The original deed from 1987, Sarah's death certificate from 2019, Jake's death certificate from September, my property tax receipts going back 36 years. Everything was in my name, always had been. But I needed more than legal ownership to win this fight. I needed to understand exactly who I was fighting against. Because the woman who'd sat in my kitchen yesterday, talking about senior communities and financial sense, wasn't the same woman who'd cried at Jake's funeral 6 months ago. People don't change that fast unless they were never who you thought they were in the first place. That afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office to pull copies of all the property records. Not because I needed them for proof, I already had the originals, but because I wanted to see if anyone else had been checking on the ownership status of my house. The clerk, a friendly woman named Dorothy, pulled the files for me. "You're the second person this month asking about this property," she mentioned. "Really?" "Mm-hmm. Young woman came in about 3 weeks ago, said she was handling estate planning. Seemed disappointed when she saw the ownership records." Estate planning. 3 weeks ago would have been mid-November. Right around the time Stephanie started making those phone calls about property values. She'd already been checking. She'd already discovered that Jake had never owned the house, and she was still trying to convince me to leave, which meant this wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was about something else entirely. Driving home, I realized that Stephanie's plan was probably simpler than I'd thought. Pressure the grieving old man into leaving. Once I was gone, claim abandonment or adverse possession. Get some lawyer to argue that she'd been the primary resident and caretaker of the property. It might have worked, too. If I'd been a different kind of grieving father. If I'd been broken instead of focused. But Stephanie had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated a history teacher who'd spent 40 years learning that knowledge without action is worthless, but knowledge with preparation is unstoppable. By the time I got home, I knew exactly what I was going to do. February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day. I should have known Stephanie would choose that date for maximum impact. I came home from my weekly grocery run to find cars parked all along Maple Street, music coming from my house, laughter, the sound of a party in full swing, a party I hadn't been invited to, in my own home. I parked in my driveway behind Travis's F-150 and walked through my front door. 25 people were scattered through my living room and kitchen. Some I recognized, Jake's co-workers from the Ford plant, a few neighbors, people from church. Others were strangers, probably Stephanie's friends or Travis's crowd. Stephanie was in the center of it all, wearing a red dress I'd never seen before, and laughing at something Travis had said. She had her hand on his arm, completely comfortable, like they'd been together for years instead of months. Travis had been quieter lately when he came around, asking fewer questions about timelines and legal details. Smart man, he could probably sense which way this situation was heading. The moment she saw me, Stephanie's face changed. "Bill, you're home." She said it like I was the one who didn't belong there. "Everyone, this is Jake's father, Bill." A few people nodded politely. Most just stared. The conversation died for about 10 seconds, then slowly resumed at a lower volume. I noticed the changes immediately. Jake's Purple Heart display had been moved from above the fireplace to a bookshelf in the corner. The wedding photo of Sarah and me was gone entirely. In its place, Stephanie had hung a large canvas print of her and Jake from their honeymoon. "What's the occasion?" I asked. "Oh, just a little get-together," Stephanie said. "You know, celebrating new beginnings, new chapters." Travis appeared beside her with 2 glasses of wine. "Bill, good to see you again, sir." He handed Stephanie her glass, and I noticed how naturally they moved together, like a couple who'd been together much longer than 4 months. "New chapters," I repeated. "That's right," Stephanie said, raising her voice so the whole room could hear. "Sometimes life forces us to turn the page, you know? Embrace change instead of clinging to the past." A woman I didn't recognize nodded sympathetically. "It's so brave of you, Stephanie, starting fresh after such a terrible loss." "Well," Stephanie said, "Jake would want me to be happy. He'd want me to move forward, not spend the rest of my life living in a museum." A museum. She was calling the home where I'd raised my son a museum. I watched her work the room for the next hour. She was good at it, charming, confident, playing the role of the young widow who'd found love again. People seemed genuinely happy for her, Why wouldn't they be? She was young, beautiful, and had apparently found someone to help her through her grief. They didn't know that Travis had been coming around since October. They didn't know about the phone calls and the property assessments and the senior community brochures. Around 8 o'clock, Stephanie tapped her wine glass with a knife. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a minute." The room went quiet. "I wanted to thank you all for being here tonight, for supporting me through this difficult transition." She paused, looking around the room with practiced emotion. Jake's death was devastating, obviously, but I've learned that grief doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter. Murmurs of agreement. Someone said, "Amen." That's why I've made some big decisions lately. About my future, about this house, about what Jake would really want for me. My stomach tightened. Travis has been such a blessing during this time. He's helped me realize that I can't live in the past forever. And honestly, she looked directly at me, I think everyone deserves to live somewhere that makes them happy, not somewhere that makes them sad. More nods. It was a beautiful speech, except she was talking about my house like it was hers to give away. So I wanted to share some exciting news with all of Jake's friends and family. She took Travis's hand. Next month, I'll be moving to a fresh start, somewhere without all these painful memories, and I've found a wonderful place for Bill to live too. The room went completely silent. Sunshine Manor is a beautiful senior community just 20 minutes from here. They have activities, meal plans, transportation to doctor's appointments, everything Bill needs at his age. I felt every eye in the room turned to me. 25 people, all waiting to see how the old man would react to being publicly informed about his living arrangements. "Bill's been staying here since Jake passed," Stephanie continued, "which was so sweet of him to help me through the worst of it. But now it's time for both of us to move on, start new chapters." She was doing it. Right here in front of everyone who'd known Jake, she was announcing my eviction like it was an act of kindness. Sunshine Manor has an opening on March 15th. Perfect timing, really, because that's when Travis and I will need to... She gestured vaguely. "Well, when we'll need the space." A woman from church spoke up. "That sounds wonderful, Stephanie. Bill, you must be excited about all those activities." I looked around the room. These people, most of whom had known Jake since he was a kid, were all nodding approvingly. They believed Stephanie's story completely. The grieving widow helping her elderly father-in-law transition to appropriate senior care. "Actually," I said quietly, "I won't be moving to Sunshine Manor." Stephanie's smile faltered slightly. "Bill, we talked about this. It's really for the best." "We didn't talk about anything. You talked to a room full of people about my life in my house." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. "Your house?" Travis stepped forward. "Bill, I think there might be some confusion here." "No confusion," I said. "This house has been in my name since 1987. Jake lived here, but he never owned it. And neither does Stephanie." You could have heard a pin drop. Stephanie's face went red. "That's not... Jake told me this house would be mine someday." Jake loved this house. It was his childhood home. But legal ownership and emotional attachment are two different things. "You're being ridiculous," Stephanie said, her voice getting shrill. "Of course Jake owned this house. We were married." "We're married," I corrected gently. "And marriage doesn't automatically transfer property ownership." Someone near the kitchen whispered, "Oh my God." "Bill, you're obviously confused," Stephanie said, looking around the room for support. "This is Jake's house. Now it's my house. You're just staying here temporarily." "Stephanie," I said, "would you like me to show everyone the deed?" The party was over. People started making excuses about babysitters and early mornings. Travis was already gathering coats. Within 10 minutes, my house was empty except for Stephanie and me. She stood in my living room, surrounded by empty wine glasses and Valentine's Day decorations, staring at me like I'd just ruined her life. "You humiliated me," she said. "You announced my eviction to 25 people without asking me first. In my own home, on Valentine's Day, while introducing your boyfriend to Jake's friends." "Travis isn't my boyfriend. He's helping me with financial planning." I walked to the window and looked out at his F-150. still parked in my driveway. Stephanie, does financial planning usually require sleeping over 3 nights a week? Her mouth fell open. Did you think I was blind? Or just stupid? She started to say something, then stopped. For the first time since Jake's funeral, she looked genuinely afraid. Tomorrow morning, I said quietly, you're going to get an eviction notice. It'll have your name on it, not mine, and it'll be perfectly legal. 'Cause this is my house, and you're no longer welcome here. I headed for the stairs, then turned back. Oh, and Stephanie? When you pack your things, leave Jake's Purple Heart where it belongs, above the fireplace, where his memory can be honored properly. I went upstairs to Jake's room and closed the door. Outside, I heard Travis's truck start up and drive away. The war was about to begin. March 17th, 2024. 3 days after Stephanie's Valentine's Day disaster, and 1 day after I'd served her with a legal eviction notice. She'd spent those 3 days making frantic phone calls to lawyers, searching for someone who'd tell her what she wanted to hear. But property law is property law, and no amount of tears or threats could change the fact that her name had never been on any deed. That's when she decided to fight back the only way she knew how, by making me look like the villain. She called it a memorial celebration for Jake. Sent out Facebook invitations to everyone who'd known my son. The post was perfect, just the right mix of grief and hope, with photos of Jake in uniform and a caption about honoring his memory while celebrating the love that survives. What she didn't mention was that it was really a public relations campaign designed to paint me as the cruel father-in-law throwing out his grieving daughter-in-law. I knew because Linda Torres had been monitoring Stephanie's social media for 6 weeks. Her surveillance report was sitting on my kitchen table. 47 pages of photos, phone records, financial transactions, and social media screenshots that told a very different story than the one Stephanie had been performing. The party was scheduled for 2 o'clock on Sunday. By 1:45, cars were lining Maple Street again. I watched from Jake's bedroom window as people I'd known for decades walked up to my front door carrying casseroles and flowers, believing they were supporting a young widow in her time of need. At exactly 2 o'clock, I walked downstairs. The living room was packed. I recognized most of the faces. Teachers from the high school where I'd worked, neighbors from our street, members of St. Matthew's Church, veterans from Jake's American Legion post. These were good people who'd known Jake since he was a kid, people who'd respected our family for 30 years. Stephanie had transformed my house into a shrine. Jake's photos were everywhere, mixed with flowers and candles. She'd even found his old high school football jersey and draped it over a chair. It was beautiful, respectful, and completely designed to make anyone who criticized her look heartless. She was standing near the fireplace, wearing a black dress and holding a framed photo of Jake in his army uniform. When she saw me, her face lit up with that practiced smile. "Everyone, look who decided to join us," she announced. "Jake's father, Bill." Polite applause. A few people nodded at me sympathetically. I could see it in their faces. They'd heard Stephanie's version of recent events, the poor widow being evicted by her heartless father-in-law. "Bill, we were just sharing memories of Jake," said Carol Henderson from church. "Stephanie was telling us about some of the changes you've both been going through." "Changes?" I repeated. "It's so difficult when families disagree about how to move forward," said Tom Phillips, Jake's former football coach. "But I'm sure you two can work something out. For Jake's sake." Stephanie stepped forward, still holding Jake's photo. "Bill's been struggling with my decision to start dating again. I understand it's hard for him to see me moving on." Murmurs of sympathy. These people had buried their own spouses, raised their own children. They understood grief, and they understood that life goes on. "The thing is," Stephanie continued, "I can't live in the past forever. Jake wouldn't want that for me. But Bill, well, he's having trouble accepting that this house might not be the best place for either of us anymore." "Change is always hard," said Martha Wilson from next door, "especially for older folks." Older folks. Like I was some confused elderly man who couldn't adapt to new circumstances. I looked around the room at these people who'd known me for decades. People who'd attended Sarah's funeral, who'd brought meals when Jake was deployed, who'd respected me as a teacher and a neighbor and a father. Now they were looking at me like I was the problem. Actually, I said, I think there are some things you should all know before we continue this memorial service. Bill, Stephanie said quickly, maybe this isn't the right time for... It's exactly the right time. I walked to the front door and opened it. James, could you come in, please? James Fletcher stepped into my living room carrying a leather briefcase and wearing his best courtroom suit. The room went completely quiet. Everyone, this is James Fletcher. He was Jake's Little League coach, and now he's my attorney. James, could you explain to everyone who owns this house? James opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. According to Marion County property records, this house has been owned by William Harrison since 1987. Mr. Harrison's son Jake lived here as a resident, but was never listed as an owner on any deed or title document. You could have heard a pin drop. That means, James continued, that Jake's death did not transfer ownership of this property to his widow. Mrs. Parker has been living here as Mr. Harrison's guest. Carol Henderson looked confused. But Stephanie, you said Jake left you the house. He did? Stephanie's voice was getting shrill. Jake always told me this house would be mine someday. Telling someone they'll inherit property and actually willing it to them are different things, James said gently. I've reviewed Jake's will. He left his personal belongings, his car, and his savings account to his wife. He had no real estate to will to anyone. I watched 25 people process this information. These weren't stupid people. They understood what James was telling them. But if that's true, said Tom Phillips slowly, then why is Stephanie saying she's being evicted from her own house? Because, I said quietly, Stephanie hasn't been entirely honest about what's been happening here. Stephanie's face went white. Bill, don't... James, could you share the timeline we discussed? James pulled out another document. Based on evidence gathered by a licensed private investigator, Mrs. Parker began a romantic relationship with Mr. Travis Mitchell in October 2023. Jake Harrison died in September 2023. The math was simple enough that everyone in the room could do it. October minus September equals 1 month. That can't be right, whispered someone in the back. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the same one I'd been using to document Stephanie's phone calls for months. This is a conversation Stephanie had with Travis on November 15th, 2023, in this house, while I was visiting Jake's grave. I pressed play. Stephanie's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. I know it's frustrating, baby, but I have to be smart about this. The old man's been paying all the bills anyway. Once I figure out how to get him out of here, we can sell this place and get something that's actually ours. Travis's voice. How long do you think that'll take? Stephanie. Not long. He's old and sad, probably grateful for an excuse to give up. Men like that, they don't fight for anything. The silence in my living room was deafening. I stopped the recording. That was 2 months after my son's funeral. 2 months after Stephanie stood in St. Matthew's Church and promised to honor Jake's memory. Carol Henderson was staring at Stephanie like she'd never seen her before. Stephanie, is this true? It's not what it sounds like, Stephanie said desperately. That conversation was taken out of context. I was exploring options for both of us. Options like senior communities, I asked. Like Sunshine Manor? You need appropriate care. I need appropriate care, or you need me out of the way. James cleared his throat. There's more evidence if anyone would like to see it. He opened a manila envelope and pulled out photographs. These were taken by a licensed private investigator between November 2023 and February 2024. He handed the first photo to Carol Henderson. Her face went gray. Travis Mitchell's truck in Mr. Harrison's driveway, November 23rd, 11:47 p.m., Thanksgiving night. He handed out more photos. December 8th, 2:15 a.m., December 19th, 10:30 p.m., January 14th, 1:45 a.m. These show Mr. Mitchell staying overnight regularly, beginning approximately 6 weeks after Jake's death. Martha Wilson was looking at one of the photos. Stephanie, you told me you were seeing a grief counselor. I was. I am. Travis Mitchell isn't a grief counselor, James said. He's a property management consultant. He and Mrs. Parker have been researching the sale value of this house since October. He pulled out more documents. Property assessment requests, mortgage pre-approval applications, real estate listing inquiries, all dated between October and December 2023. Tom Phillips stood up. Stephanie, you've been planning to sell this house since 2 months after Jake died? You don't understand, Stephanie said, tears starting to flow. I can't live here anymore. Everything reminds me of him. I need to start over. Then you should start over, I said quietly. In your own place, with your own money, not by stealing my son's childhood home and lying to everyone who loved him. The room was turning against her. I could see it in their faces, the shock, the disappointment, the betrayal. These people had brought casseroles and flowers to support a grieving widow. Instead, they'd discovered a woman who'd been planning her next relationship before her husband was even buried. This isn't fair, Stephanie said, looking around for support that was no longer there. Bill's trying to make me look like a monster, but Jake loved me. He would want me to be happy. Jake loved you, I agreed. But Jake also loved this house. He loved his childhood memories here. He loved knowing his parents had built something lasting here. I walked to the fireplace and touched the Purple Heart display. Jake would want you to be happy, Stephanie, but he wouldn't want you to sell his father's house to fund your happiness. And he sure as hell wouldn't want you to do it with another man's help while pretending it was about grief counseling. Dr. Patricia Green, Jake's oncologist, was at the back of the room. She'd been quiet until now, but suddenly she spoke up. Mrs. Parker, I need to ask you something. During Jake's final weeks of treatment, you missed several appointments. When you did come, you spent most of the time on your phone. At the time, I assumed you were handling funeral arrangements or work issues. Stephanie didn't answer. But if you were already in a relationship with someone else, were you prioritizing that relationship over your dying husband's medical care? The question hung in the air like a sword. I was there, Stephanie whispered. I was always there. When Jake asked me to help him update his will, said James Fletcher, he specifically mentioned wanting to make sure his father would always have a place to live. He was worried about Mr. Harrison being alone after he passed. The idea that his widow would try to evict his father from his own home would have horrified him. That was the moment Stephanie broke. You want to know the truth? She screamed. Fine. The truth is that Jake was dying for 8 months. 8 months of hospitals and treatments and vomiting and watching him disappear a little more every day. The truth is that I was 29 years old, and my husband was dying, and I was supposed to just, what? Sit here in this depressing house forever, surrounded by his things, pretending to be happy? The room recoiled like she'd slapped them. The truth is that Travis makes me feel alive again. He makes me laugh. He doesn't smell like chemotherapy, and he doesn't wake up screaming from nightmares, and he doesn't need me to help him to the bathroom. She was crying now, but they weren't sympathetic tears anymore. They were angry, bitter tears. So yes, I met someone else. Yes, I wanted to sell this house. Yes, I wanted Bill gone because staying here was killing me just as slowly as cancer killed Jake. 25 people stared at her in complete silence. I looked at this woman my son had loved enough to marry. This woman who'd just publicly admitted that she'd abandoned him emotionally before he'd even died. Stephanie, I said quietly, you have until Friday to move out. After that, anything you leave behind becomes part of my property. She looked around the room one more time, desperate for someone to defend her, someone to understand her position. No one spoke. She grabbed her purse and ran for the door. Travis's F-150 was waiting in the driveway. After Stephanie slammed the door, 25 people sat in my living room processing what they had just witnessed. The memorial celebration had become a courtroom, and the verdict was unanimous. But I wasn't finished. James, I said, show them the rest. James Fletcher looked uncomfortable. Bill, are you sure? Some of this is pretty damaging. My son's friends deserve to know who they've been supporting. He opened another folder, this one marked Confidential Investigation Report. What you just heard was emotional manipulation, I said to the room. What I'm about to show you is criminal behavior. Carol Henderson looked up sharply. Criminal? James pulled out a bank statement. In December 2003, 23, Mrs. Parker attempted to access Mr. Harrison's checking account. She told First National Bank that she was handling his finances due to cognitive decline. A gasp went through the room. The bank requested medical documentation. When Mrs. Parker couldn't provide it, they flagged the account and contacted Mr. Harrison directly. I'd never told anyone about that phone call from the bank. It had been humiliating. A 22-year-old teller calling to ask if I was experiencing memory problems, if I needed help managing my money. She tried to steal from you? Martha Wilson looked horrified. Attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, James said. It's a felony in Indiana. Tom Phillips leaned forward. What else? Linda Torres stepped out from where she'd been waiting quietly in the kitchen. She was a small woman with graying hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent years in uniform. I'm Linda Torres, private investigator. Mr. Harrison hired me in December to document his daughter-in-law's activities. She set a thick folder on the coffee table. Over the past 3 months, I've documented approximately 40 instances of Mr. Mitchell staying overnight at this property. During this same period, Mrs. Parker made 16 posts on social media about her grief journey and the importance of honoring her husband's memory. She opened her laptop and turned it toward the room. This is Mrs. Parker's Instagram account from January 15th. The screen showed Stephanie in a black dress, standing next to Jake's grave with her head bowed. The caption read, 6 months without you, still learning to breathe again, widow, grief, one day at a time. This photo was posted at 2:47 p.m., Linda continued. At 6:30 p.m. that same day, she posted this to her private Snapchat story. The next image showed Stephanie and Travis at an expensive restaurant, laughing over champagne. She was wearing a red dress, and Travis had his arm around her. The caption read, Best dinner ever, new beginnings. Blessed, moving on. The room was dead silent. She was posting grief photos for sympathy while celebrating her new relationship on the same day. Dr. Green looked sick. It gets worse, Linda said. She pulled up another series of screenshots. Mrs. Parker created a GoFundMe page in January, claiming she was struggling to pay for Jake's medical bills and funeral expenses. I felt my stomach drop. I'd had no idea about this. The page raised $4,300 from friends, family, and strangers who wanted to help a struggling young widow. Linda pulled up bank records. During this same period, Mrs. Parker spent $6,700 on dinners, shopping, and a weekend trip to Chicago with Mr. Mitchell. She was using donation money to fund dates with her boyfriend, James summarized. Tom Phillips stood up. This is fraud. It's worse than fraud, said Dr. Green quietly. Jake's medical bills were paid by his insurance and his father. The funeral was paid by his father. There were no outstanding expenses. I looked around the room at people who'd known Jake since he was 8 years old. People who'd cheered for him at football games, who'd prayed for him when he was deployed, who'd cried at his funeral. She took money from people who wanted to honor my son's memory, I said, and she spent it on the man she was cheating with. Linda wasn't finished. She pulled out a series of text message screenshots. These are conversations between Mrs. Parker and Mr. Mitchell from February. She read aloud. Stephanie to Travis, February 8th. The old man is getting suspicious. We need to speed this up. Travis to Stephanie. Maybe we should cool it for a while. Stephanie to Travis. No way, I'm not spending another month in this mausoleum. If he won't leave voluntarily, we'll make him leave. Make him leave how? Asked Carol Henderson. Linda pulled up more messages. February 12th. Stephanie to Travis. I found a lawyer who says we can claim adverse possession if we can prove abandonment. We just need to get him out for 30 days. Adverse possession? Martha Wilson looked confused. James Fletcher explained. It's a legal principle where someone can claim ownership of property if they've lived there openly for a certain period, while the real owner has abandoned it. It almost never works, but if I'd moved to Sunshine Manor voluntarily, I said, Stephanie could have argued that I'd abandoned the property and she was the rightful resident. That's why she was so insistent about the senior community, Linda continued, and when that didn't work, they moved to Plan B. She pulled out the final set of documents. March 10th, Mrs. Parker filed a petition claiming Mr. Harrison was mentally incompetent and needed a guardian. She requested to be appointed as his legal guardian, which would give her control over his property. The room exploded. "She tried to have you declared incompetent." Carol was standing now, furious. The petition claimed that Mr. Harrison was suffering from dementia, that he was unable to care for himself, and that he needed supervised living arrangements, James said. She submitted character references from Travis Mitchell and two of his friends, all claiming they'd witnessed concerning behavior. "What kind of behavior?" demanded Tom Phillips. Linda read from the petition. "Forgetting to pay bills, confusion about daily activities, inappropriate emotional responses to normal conversation, inability to understand financial concepts." I thought about the eviction notice Stephanie had handed me 6 months ago. She'd been building a case against me from the very beginning. The hearing was scheduled for March 20th, James said. If successful, Stephanie would have been granted legal control over Mr. Harrison's finances and property. "Which means," I said quietly, "she could have sold this house without my consent and committed me to a care facility against my will." Dr. Green was shaking her head. "Bill, I've known you for 15 years. You're one of the sharpest people I've ever met." "The petition was denied yesterday," James announced. "The judge reviewed Mr. Harrison's medical records, spoke with his doctors, and found no evidence of cognitive decline. He also noted that Mrs. Parker's motives appeared suspect given the property dispute." I looked around the room at people who'd known me for decades. People who'd trusted Stephanie's story about the confused old man who needed appropriate care. "She almost pulled it off," I said. "If I hadn't hired Linda, if I hadn't documented everything, if I'd just been a different kind of grieving father, she would have succeeded." Martha Wilson was crying. "Bill, we're so sorry. We believed her." "You believed her because she told you what you expected to hear. That grief makes people weak and confused. That old men can't take care of themselves. That young widows need protection and support." I walked to the fireplace where Jake's purple heart hung in its place of honor. But here's what Stephanie never understood about grief. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you focused. And when someone tries to profit from your child's death, when they try to erase his memory and steal his father's home, well, that's when you find out exactly how strong grief can make you. Linda Torres packed up her evidence. James Fletcher closed his briefcase. 25 people sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that they'd been supporting a criminal who'd been systematically planning to destroy everything Jake had loved. Outside, Travis's F-150 was gone. Stephanie was gone. But Jake's house, my house, was still here, still standing, still holding 37 years of memories that no one could steal or sell or lie away. The war was over, and for the first time in 6 months, I could breathe again. The legal consequences started immediately. By Tuesday morning, the Marion County Prosecutor's Office had opened an investigation into Stephanie's GoFundMe fraud. By Wednesday, the FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force was reviewing the attempted guardianship scam. By Friday, Stephanie Parker was facing 3 felony charges: attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, fraud by deception, and filing false legal documents. Her mugshot appeared in the Indianapolis Star on Saturday morning, right next to an article titled "Local Dental Hygienist Charged in Elaborate Scheme to Steal Veterans' Home." The reporter had interviewed several people from the memorial service, and their quotes were devastating. "She fooled all of us," said Carol Henderson. "We thought we were helping a grieving widow, but we were enabling a con artist." Travis Mitchell, described in the article as Parker's alleged accomplice, had disappeared entirely. His property management business was closed, his apartment was empty, and his phone was disconnected. Smart man. He'd seen which way the wind was blowing and gotten out before the investigation reached him. But the legal system was just the beginning. The social consequences were swift and total. Stephanie's Facebook page, which had chronicled her grief journey for 6 months, was flooded with comments from people who donated to her GoFundMe. The posts ranged from disappointed to furious to threatening legal action. "I gave you $200 because I thought you couldn't afford groceries," wrote one donor. "You spent it on champagne dinners with your boyfriend. Disgusting." "My husband died last year, and I know how hard it is," wrote another. "What you did makes it harder for widows who actually need help. Shame on you." The dental office where Stephanie worked fired her on Monday morning. Their official statement cited conduct incompatible with our professional standards and patient trust. Unofficially, according to Linda Torres, 3 patients had already requested different hygienists after seeing the news coverage. Stephanie's landlord evicted her from her apartment on Tuesday. Indiana law allows immediate eviction for tenants facing felony charges related to fraud. She had 72 hours to remove her belongings. Her social media following collapsed. The Instagram account that had once boasted 5,200 followers dropped to 340 within a week. Most of the remaining followers seemed to be there for the entertainment value, leaving comments like, "Where's Travis?" and "How's that new beginning working out?" The American Legion Post, where Jake had been a member, issued a formal statement condemning Stephanie's actions and expressing support for our family. They also announced that they were reviewing their assistance protocols to prevent similar exploitation in the future. St. Matthew's Church, where Stephanie had been a member for 3 years, quietly removed her from their member directory. Pastor Williams called me personally to apologize for not seeing through her performance earlier. "She seemed so devoted during Jake's illness," he said. "I should have noticed that grief doesn't usually look that polished." The most satisfying consequence came from an unexpected source. Jake's Army unit, the 1st Infantry Division, had maintained a private Facebook group for veterans and their families. When word of Stephanie's crimes reached them, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, Jake's former squad leader, posted a message that was shared hundreds of times. "Jake Harrison died serving his country, and his father raised a hero. Any woman who would try to steal from a Gold Star family and profit from a soldier's death is beneath contempt. We take care of our own, and that includes making sure people like this face consequences." Within days, veterans from across the country were sharing Stephanie's story as a warning to other military families. Her name became synonymous with the kind of predatory behavior that targeted grieving families in their most vulnerable moments. The financial impact was severe. Stephanie owed $4,300 in GoFundMe refunds, plus penalties and interest. Her legal fees were mounting rapidly. Good fraud attorneys don't come cheap. The civil lawsuits were just beginning. Several donors had filed claims not just for refunds, but for emotional distress damages. The truth about the medical bills finally came out during the investigation. Jake's treatments had cost over $100,000 total, but insurance and VA benefits had covered most of it. I'd paid the $50,000 in deductibles and non-covered treatments, money I'd willingly spent to help my dying son. Stephanie had known this all along, but created her GoFundMe anyway, claiming she was struggling with overwhelming medical debt that didn't exist. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the simplest one. She was alone. Travis was gone. Her friends had distanced themselves. Her family, according to Linda Torres, had stopped returning her calls after the felony charges were filed. The online community of military widows who had supported her had expelled her entirely. She'd traded 5 years of marriage to a good man for 4 months with a con artist who'd abandoned her the moment the scheme collapsed. On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after the memorial service showdown, I was sitting on my front porch when Linda Torres stopped by with her final report. "She's living in an extended stay motel on the east side," Linda said, "paying week to week. Travis cleaned out their joint account before he disappeared. Took about $8,000. Joint account? She'd been funneling GoFundMe money into it. Turns out Travis was skimming from the beginning. She got played harder than anyone." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "What happens next?" I asked. "Court date is set for June 15th. With the evidence we have, her lawyer will probably recommend a plea deal. Restitution, probation, maybe some jail time." Linda packed up her files and headed for her car. As she drove away, I looked up at Jake's bedroom window, where the same glow-in-the-dark stars still shone on the ceiling. My son was gone, but his memory was safe. His father's house was secure, and the woman who'd tried to profit from his death was facing the consequences of her choices. Justice isn't always swift, but sometimes it's thorough. For the first time in months, that was enough. 6 months later, my house feels like home again. I've made some changes, installed a security system, $890 well spent, changed all the locks, set up a trust fund to ensure this house stays in my family, per James Fletcher's recommendation. The Purple Heart is back above the fireplace where it belongs. Sarah's wedding photo has returned to its place of honor. Jake's bedroom remains exactly as he left it, but now it's a celebration of his life instead of a shrine to loss. I've also made new friends. The veterans from Jake's unit check on me regularly. Pastor Williams visits every few weeks. Even Linda Torres stops by occasionally just to see how I'm doing. The court case ended in July. Stephanie pled guilty to fraud and attempted financial exploitation. 18 months probation, full restitution to the GoFundMe donors, and a permanent restraining order keeping her away from my property. She's living in Fort Wayne now, working as a cashier under her maiden name. Travis Mitchell was arrested in Florida for running a similar scam on an elderly widower. Some people never learn, but I learned something important. Grief doesn't make you weak. It clarifies what matters. What matters is family. What matters is memory. What matters is standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Jake's story isn't about how he died. It's about how he lived, and how the people who loved him honor that life. Sometimes honoring the dead means fighting the living, and sometimes, just sometimes, the fight is worth it. Share your own stories of family betrayal below. You'd be surprised how many people need to hear that they're not alone.